I wish to acknowledge the Darkinjung people as traditional custodians on the land on which I live and work. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and recognise their continuing connection and contribution to the land.
Immunisation Foundation of Australia. Supporting immunisation, saving lives.
The Immunisation Foundation of Australia is a non-profit working to save lives through education and advocacy for vaccine prevention of disease. Welcome to Matter of Vax. I'm your host, Steph O'Connell. Join me and find out what is Matter of Vax. Our guest today is Dr. Rod Pearce. He's the chair of the Immunisation Coalition and a general practitioner and policy advisor, and a former member of the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, ATAGI. He was awarded the Order of Australia in 2012 for services to medicine. I want to welcome him today.
G'day, it's good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Really important subject we're covering today. It's the National Immunisation Program. First of all, let's go right back to basics. What is what we affectionately call the NIP?
It's something that Australia has rolled out really in the last 25 years, and it's always been a point of contention between the medical people who advise government and funding programs. And there's a tension between what is recommended by ATAGI, what's recommended by expert groups, and what the Commonwealth is prepared to pay for. And the National Immunisation Program essentially is what the government pays for in vaccines.
How does it work? How do vaccines end up on the National Immunisation Program?
25 years ago, the advisory group, essentially ATAGI, would make a recommendation. So it was a technical advisory group to government and say, this is a vaccine we should have. And it would essentially automatically become a funded program. About 15 years ago, the government said this is getting expensive because what's recommended isn't always possible to immediately put through a budgeted progress. And so the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, PBAC, started to scrutinise it. So now when a vaccine is recommended by the technical group, it goes before the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee to make a cost-benefit analysis, and then once PBAC makes a recommendation, then funding is usually made available on their advice. That will then end up becoming part of the National Immunisation Program. That is loosely associated with a schedule, and it's always been a little bit controversial because if we've got a schedule recommended by medical people, but the government isn't happy and doesn't fund it, then there's a disparity between what's being recommended and what's being funded.
The NIP is really complex. What vaccines are currently on the schedule?
Things like tetanus, diphtheria, whooping cough, meningitis, measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox is part of that schedule. What everyone now would consider standard vaccines and essentially is taken for granted in Australia is part of the childhood vaccines. Australia's got a reputation for some of the world's best childhood vaccination rates. And then after that, in the teenage years at 50 and over 65 and 70 is complicated. And that's one of the challenges for Australia to actually end up with 90% vaccination rates on past the age of school.
It's also a good question to ask. Who has access to the National Immunisation Program scheduled vaccines?
Again, that's evolved in the last probably few years. Providers were traditionally local government, some state bodies, but general practitioners. Now that's included pharmacists and a few other groups. So that's open to changes and recommendations. At the moment, primary care is the main provider of the National Immunisation Program, and those vaccines are usually purchased by the Commonwealth and distributed to the states, who then give them to GPs as the main provider.
And in the population, with each vaccine, there's a different list of targeted individuals. Can you explain how we arrive at that eligibility?
Essentially, that comes from a recommendation from the Technical Advisory Group. So ATAGI would make a recommendation that the most at-risk groups of a disease who would benefit from a vaccine are, and then make some recommendations. And so influenza is a great example that we fund through the National Immunisation Program, everyone over 65. Recently, we've added the 6 months to 5-year-old as part of the National Immunisation Program, but not until this year was a part of the schedule. Those of us who work in this area say we'd like the government to fund everyone.
How do we compare with the rest of the world?
Well, still for childhood immunisation rates, vaccines, we lead the world in the number that we provide and also the rates that we get with close to 90%. We've only just included flu as, first of all, part of our recommendations for children and then part of the schedule. And we've also had the no jab, no pay, no jab, no play. Although it's controversial, it has raised awareness. Originally designed in the 90s as a support for families to actually get vaccines, but now been seen as a bit of a punishment if they don't. So you've still got some bugs to iron out, but we do exceptionally well.
You mentioned state programs. They play a very big part when there's a surge, specifically with meningococcal back in 2014, 15, 16. States jumped on board NIP. The vaccine ended up on NIP after that. It's a great example. How quickly can we respond to disease, do you think?
That was a fascinating experiment in how Australia's system evolves and changes, and I think to some extent has shown an improvement. So what happened is that throughout Australia there were outbreaks of MenW, and different states said, well, we need to respond to that. And so when 3 of the states decided that they should fund ACWY instead of just the C meningitis vaccines program, the Commonwealth said, well, maybe we should step forward and do it. And the irony of that is there are 2 vaccines needed to get complete meningitis cover. But because W was something that the states were supporting through the ACWY, which is now part of the National Immunisation Program, only 1 state has actually stepped forward to cover Men B. So it evolved by the states recognising there was a problem. They intervened by running their own programs. The Commonwealth looked at how many states were doing it and were persuaded to run it as part of the national program. And so instead of just a single meningitis C recommendation at 12 months, it was changed to ACWY, which we all thought was a great improvement.
I want to talk quickly about vaccines that aren't on the NOP and what happens when you're not eligible for vaccines, and how are we getting access to these other vaccines?
If you're looking for vaccines that aren't funded as part of the National Immunisation Program, you have to go to either fund it privately, and that creates some issues about the ethics of people who can afford it and who can't. And providers are often making a decision on behalf of their patients to think, oh, they can't afford it, so I won't recommend it. And that's an important rallying call to all providers to at least alert patients of what vaccines are available and what they might like to get. Don't forget your private health funds, but it may just fall back to you funding it through your own pocket.
With the National Immunisation Program, it's so incredibly complex, and I'm so glad you've helped unpick that for us today. How do you see the National Immunisation Program evolving?
We think there's an onus on each of those at-risk groups to work with their support groups and advisory groups to make sure they've got access and awareness of the vaccines. Some work needs to be done with the government to openly acknowledge that a recommended and not funded vaccine isn't a disgrace to the Commonwealth government, and it shouldn't be seen as an insult or something to be avoided. It should just be openly talked about to say, look, we don't fund all the vaccines that are recommended because funding is about population health, and that's a different criteria than an individual's benefit. And we think there needs to be some public discussion about that. And it's ongoing work with anyone interested in vaccines to actually be talking about it. So I really appreciate the opportunity today to talk about some of the anomalies and help people understand that it may not be funded, but it's still a good vaccine. It's still been recommended, and it's still worth an individual considering it for themselves and for their family.
Rod, I want to thank you for coming on and helping us understand National Immunisation Program. If you've enjoyed Matter of Vax, please subscribe and share with your friends. You can also follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. For more Matter of Vax podcast and video education on this and other vaccine-preventable diseases, visit www.ifa.org.au. The Immunisation Foundation of Australia is a non-profit working to save lives through education and advocacy for vaccine prevention of disease.
Immunisation Foundation of Australia. Supporting immunisation, saving lives.